In today's rapidly shifting world, chaos isn't the exception, it's the rule. Entire industries collapse overnight. Reputations are destroyed with a single tweet, and the line between victory and ruin is razor thin. Everyone wants to stay ahead, but few truly understand what it takes to outmaneuver life itself. And that's why the lessons of Miyamoto Musashi, a warrior who lived over 400 years ago, might be more relevant today than ever. Musashi wasn't just another swordsman in feudal Japan. He was a strategist, a thinker, and a man who turned survival into an art form. His genius was not only in how he cut down 60 opponents in duels to the death without a single defeat, but in how he understood that life itself is a battlefield. The terrain may have changed. Back then it was dusty roads and clashing steel, while today it's boardrooms, social media, politics, and personal rivalries. But the principles remain the same: strategy, adaptability, and above all, the ability to see 10 moves ahead while everyone else is distracted by the present. The truth is, Musashi's story is not just about the art of the sword, it's about the art of outsmarting. He showed that true dominance isn't loud, flashy, or brute force. It's quiet, calculated, and almost invisible until it's too late for your opponent to respond. In a time where most warriors believed strength was enough, Musashi proved that the sharpest blade was always the mind. So as we dive into the life and teachings of Musashi, remember this: legends aren't born from comfort, they're forged in adversity. His journey wasn't one of privilege or ease, it was carved in the chaos of a fractured Japan, where betrayal was constant, violence was a way of life, and only the cunning survived. Musashi rose from this crucible not just as a fighter, but as a living blueprint for anyone who dares to stay ahead in a world where unpredictability is the only constant. Forged in hardship, every legend begins with struggle, and Musashi's life was no exception. If anything, his rise to greatness was fueled by hardships so severe that most would have broken under the weight of them. To understand the mind of Musashi, you first have to understand the world that shaped him. He was born in 1584, during one of the most violent and unstable eras in Japanese history. The land was fractured, torn apart by warring factions, shifting alliances, and an endless cycle of betrayal. Power was never stable for long. What was gained in the morning could be lost by nightfall. It was a time where every man carried a sword, and where a single mistake could cost not just your life, but the honor of your family. For a child to grow up in such an environment was to be forced into a crash course in survival, and Musashi was thrust into this reality before he could even understand it. Orphaned at a young age, Musashi didn't have the luxury of a stable home or the warmth of parental guidance. Where other children were nurtured, he was hardened. Where others found safety, he found chaos. The world became his teacher, and its lessons were brutal. Hunger, cold, violence, loss. These weren't occasional trials for Musashi, they were the fabric of his existence. And while such conditions might crush the spirit of most, they carved something different in him, a relentless will to endure. By his early teens, Musashi was already fighting duels. Think about that for a moment. While most boys his age were still playing or learning under masters, Musashi had already stepped into life or death combat. The first recorded duel he fought was at just 13 years old against a seasoned warrior named Arima Kehei. By all logic, this should have ended with Musashi's body lying in the dirt, but instead, he fought with such ferocity and unpredictability that he killed his opponent, securing his very first victory. It was a moment that would define him, not because it showcased polished skill, but because it revealed a truth that would stay with him forever. Survival belongs to the one who refuses to quit, no matter the odds. Yet this victory didn't come without consequences. Killing at such a young age marked Musashi as dangerous. Whispers spread quickly, and the boy with nothing became the boy to fear. But in a society that respected strength above all, this reputation wasn't a curse, it was an advantage. Every duel after that became both a test and a performance. He wasn't just defending himself. He was building a legend, one blade stroke at a time. Still, Musashi's path wasn't a straight line of victories. He learned through failure, through exhaustion, through the shame of realizing his technique was sloppy or his planning incomplete. Where others might see defeat, Musashi saw data. Every mistake became a lesson. Every setback became a blueprint for improvement. He was relentless in this pursuit, dissecting not only his opponents, but himself. He asked questions others avoided. Why did I nearly lose? What did my enemy see that I didn't? How can I prevent this next time? It was this mindset, turning adversity into opportunity, that began shaping him into something more than a fighter. He was becoming a strategist. The battlefield wasn't just a place of danger. It was a laboratory where he tested and refined his methods. Imagine the pressure of living like this. Each sunrise could be your last. Each duel could be the moment your story ended. And yet Musashi leaned into this reality, embracing it instead of shrinking away. While others hid from danger, he sought it out. He fought duel after duel, challenging not only rivals his own age, but also hardened veterans with reputations far greater than his. Some would say this was arrogance, but Musashi knew it was the only way to grow. You don't sharpen a blade against silk, you sharpen it against stone. As he carved his way through countless battles, Musashi began to recognize something profound. Strength was never enough on its own. He saw powerful men fall because they lacked patience. He saw skilled swordsmen defeated because they were predictable. He saw disciplined warriors lose because they couldn't adapt. These observations became the foundation of his philosophy, that strategy, adaptability, and mental control would always eclipse raw power. This wasn't just theory. It was something he proved in blood and sweat. He lived it. Every scar he carried was a reminder that the body can fail, but the mind must not. And every opponent who underestimated him learned the same truth. Musashi wasn't fighting for pride. He was fighting for survival. And survival makes you dangerous in ways training alone never could. So when we talk about Musashi as a legend, we must remember that his story didn't begin with mastery. It began with loss, isolation, and relentless struggle. He didn't rise because the path was smooth. He rose because it wasn't. Hardship forged him, orphanhood sharpened him, violence tested him, and adversity became the hammer that struck the steel of his spirit, molding him into the man who would one day be remembered not just as a swordsman, but as a philosopher of war and life. But his early struggles were only the beginning. The boy who survived his first duel at 13 would go on to develop methods so radical and philosophies so profound that they would redefine what it meant to fight and to live. And it all began with a single realization: to win, you must be willing to become something more than your circumstances. The sword as a mind weapon. To most warriors, the sword was nothing more than an extension of the arm, a sharpened piece of steel meant to cut down an enemy. But for Musashi, the sword was far more than that. It was an extension of the mind. Where others saw a weapon, he saw a mirror, one that revealed discipline, emotion, and weakness. To wield the sword without understanding the mind was, in his view, to enter battle already defeated. This perspective set Musashi apart from nearly every warrior of his time. The samurai code often emphasized honor, loyalty, and skill with the blade. Training halls across Japan were filled with young men practicing endless repetitions of strikes and parries, drilling their reflexes until muscle memory replaced thought. And while this dedication produced many skilled fighters, it also created a dangerous blind spot: predictability. Musashi recognized early that reflexes alone couldn't win battles. If you became a machine repeating the same movements, a strategist could dismantle you without breaking a sweat. Musashi's genius was his ability to look beyond the surface. He studied not just how men fought, but how they thought. He believed every movement in battle began in the mind before it ever reached the hand. If you could anticipate what your opponent believed, feared, or expected, You could strike before the duel even began. And this wasn't just theory. It was the secret behind his unbroken streak of victories. Witnesses to his duels often remarked that Musashi seemed strangely calm, almost detached, even when his life hung in the balance. While others clenched their jaws and gripped their swords in desperation, he appeared as though he were observing a performance. And in truth, he was. To Musashi, a duel wasn't a clash of steel, it was a chess match played in real time. His opponent was just another puzzle to solve. He became a master of unsettling his rivals before the first strike. Sometimes, he would arrive late to a duel, keeping his opponent waiting, simmering with anger, and exhausting themselves mentally before he even showed up. Other times, he would appear disheveled, dirty, or carrying a wooden sword rather than steel, lulling his enemies into arrogance. In every case, the tactic was the same: to control the battlefield of the mind before blades crossed. Because once an opponent's focus cracked, once frustration, fear, or pride slipped in, their body followed, and Musashi was there to exploit the weakness. This is why his victories weren't merely physical, they were psychological. He understood that a warrior's greatest enemy isn't always the man standing in front of him, but the voice inside his own head. And if Musashi could manipulate that voice, he didn't just win, he dominated. Think about what this means in modern terms. Today, the sword may be gone, but the principle remains. How many people lose not because they lack skill, but because they lose control of their emotions? How many arguments, negotiations, or competitions are decided not by talent, but by the ability to stay calm under pressure? Musashi's insight still cuts deep. If you control the mind, your own and your opponent's, you control the outcome. Of course, this philosophy demanded discipline. Musashi trained not just his body, but his perception. He learned to observe subtle details, the flicker of an eye, the shift of a stance, the hesitation in breath. These tiny signals revealed intentions before they became actions. In Musashi's eyes, combat was less about reaction and more about prediction. Victory was secured, not in the strike, but in the moment before the strike, when he had already read the opponent's next move. This is what made him dangerous. He wasn't faster than everyone, nor was he always stronger, but he was thinking further ahead. He carried his sword not only as a blade of steel, but as a blade of strategy, slicing into the gaps of human psychology, where others never looked. It's tempting to see Musashi purely as a warrior, but in truth, he was also a philosopher. His approach to combat reveals a larger lesson about life itself, that raw effort is meaningless without foresight, and that brute force crumbles without clarity of mind. He showed that true mastery isn't about perfecting reflexes, it's about merging the physical and the mental into one seamless weapon. For Musashi, the duel began long before his opponent even realized it had started, and that's what terrified people most. They weren't just facing a man with a sword, they were facing a mind that had already dismantled them. And yet, this was only the beginning of his strategic brilliance. Because while Musashi could dominate an opponent through sheer presence, his genius would one day be immortalized in writing, in a book that went beyond combat, into the heart of life itself. The Book of Five Rings. If Musashi's duels built his reputation, his writings secured his immortality. Toward the end of his life, when most warriors faded into obscurity or became relics of an outdated age, Musashi took the lessons he had bled for and distilled them into a single text, the Book of Five Rings, written in 1645. This work was more than a manual for combat. It was a blueprint for life, strategy, and survival. On the surface, it looks like a treatise on swordsmanship, but anyone who reads carefully quickly realizes it is much more. Each ring, earth, water, fire, wind, and void, represents not just martial technique, but an entire way of perceiving the world. Musashi was not content to simply write about where to place your feet or how to swing a blade. He wanted to reveal the inner mechanics of victory, principles that apply whether you're clashing swords, running a business, or navigating the invisible wars of human ambition. The Earth book laid the foundation. To Musashi, this was not just about the basics of combat, but about grounding yourself in principle. He emphasized structure, clarity, and mastery of fundamentals. He believed no house could stand without a foundation, and no warrior could survive without discipline. It was a reminder that even genius is built on routine, and that brilliance without structure collapses under pressure. The water book flowed into adaptability. Musashi compared strategy to water, taking the shape of whatever contains it, shifting without losing essence. In a world defined by unpredictability, rigidity is death. He urged his readers to flow like rivers, to bend without breaking, and to respond to change with calculated ease. This lesson echoes across centuries. The man who resists change will drown in it, while the man who adapts will ride its current to victory. The fire book represented the heat of battle. Fire is aggression, passion, and decisive action. Musashi recognized that there are times when patience must give way to ferocity, when holding back is more dangerous than striking. He spoke of timing attacks, overwhelming opponents, and using energy as both weapon and shield. Yet, like any flame, this fire needed control. Without discipline, passion becomes destruction. Harnessed correctly, it becomes unstoppable drive. The wind book shifted outward, examining the styles of others. Musashi dissected rival schools of combat, exposing their flaws and strengths. But his deeper point was this: you cannot dominate what you do not understand. To ignore your competitors is to walk blind into battle. True mastery requires awareness not only of yourself, but of the environment and the opposition. In modern terms, Musashi was teaching market research centuries before the concept existed. Know your rivals. Study their habits. Then use that knowledge to position yourself where they are weakest. Finally, the Void Book, perhaps the most mysterious and profound of them all. Here Musashi left the world of technique entirely. The void is the space beyond knowledge, beyond conscious thought. It is the realm of intuition, where action flows without hesitation. He described it as no mind, a state where the strategist becomes one with the moment, where decisions happen effortlessly, because preparation and instinct merge into one. To reach the void was to transcend both sword and strategy, touching the very essence of mastery. What made the Book of Five Rings extraordinary wasn't just its content, but its reach. Though penned in the language of combat, its insights transcended the battlefield. Artists, generals, politicians, and CEOs have studied its pages, each drawing lessons for their own wars, whether fought with paintbrushes, policies, or profit margins. Musashi's words resonated because they cut to the core truth: life itself is combat. The enemy might not always hold a blade, but obstacles, rivals, and unseen pressures are battles all the same. Even centuries later, his lessons echo in the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies and the studios of creative masters. When entrepreneurs pivot their businesses to adapt to markets, they are practicing Musashi's water. When leaders strike decisively after waiting for the perfect moment, they are channeling Musashi's fire. When artists refine their fundamentals before chasing innovation, they are walking Musashi's earth. And when athletes slip into the zone, performing with effortless instinct, they are touching Musashi's void. But Musashi never intended his book to be comfortable reading. His tone is sharp, stripped of ornament, as if each sentence were a strike. He didn't write to entertain. He wrote to instruct, to challenge. The Five Rings is less of a guidebook and more of a mirror, forcing readers to ask, where are my weaknesses? Where am I too rigid? Where do I hesitate when I should strike? It is this unflinching honesty that makes the book endure. And yet Musashi's most dangerous strategy wasn't written in any text, because while the Book of Five Rings gave the world his philosophy, in battle he often wielded something even more unsettling, a way of winning without ever drawing his sword. Victory without the sword. If Musashi terrified his opponents with his sword, he haunted them even more without it. Because one of his most dangerous strategies required no steel at all. He discovered that true victory often came not from cutting down an enemy, but from dismantling them mentally, long before the first strike. To Musashi, combat was never confined to the edge of the blade. It was a game of perception, pressure, and presence. The concept became known as the no-sword strategy. At its core, it was psychological warfare, and Musashi wielded it with terrifying precision. He understood that most men lost battles, not because they lacked skill, but because they lost control of their minds. Fear, frustration, pride. These emotions were far sharper than any weapon. If you could manipulate them, you could make an enemy defeat themselves. Musashi often demonstrated this in ways that seemed bizarre, even dishonorable, to his contemporaries. In one duel, he arrived so late that his opponent had been waiting for hours under the blistering sun. By the time Musashi finally appeared, his rival was exhausted, furious, and mentally unstable. The duel ended quickly. In another fight, he deliberately showed up looking filthy, unkempt, and seemingly careless. A stark contrast to the polished, armored warriors he faced. His opponent mistook this as weakness and rushed in recklessly, only to be cut down in seconds. Musashi had turned appearance itself into a weapon, but perhaps the most unsettling element of his no-sword approach was the way he used stillness. While other warriors paced, shouted, or tightened their grips in nervous anticipation, Musashi remained calm, almost statuesque. He radiated an aura of inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided. To stand before him was to face not just a man, but a presence, one that seemed unshakable, unmovable, and utterly certain of victory. Many opponents were broken before they ever raised their blade. This wasn't just intimidation for intimidation's sake, it was strategy. Musashi believed that the mind was the true battlefield, and that if you controlled it, the body followed. He once wrote that perception is strong and sight weak, a cryptic reminder that how people see the world often matters more than what the world truly is. By shaping his enemy's perception, he made them stumble into defeat. In modern terms, this principle is everywhere. Think of negotiations where the calmest person at the table usually comes out on top. Think of sports, where an athlete's composure can rattle even the most talented opponent. Or think of business, where reputation alone can secure victory before competition even begins. Musashi's no-sword strategy is the ancient root of a truth we still live by. Power often belongs not to the loudest, but to the most composed. What makes this even more profound is the restraint it required. Musashi could have relied purely on his blade, and no one would have questioned his dominance. But he chose instead to explore the realm where most warriors dared not tread, the invisible battleground of the psyche. This showed not only his brilliance as a fighter, but his evolution as a thinker. He was no longer just a swordsman seeking to win duels. He was a strategist, probing the deepest corners of human behavior. And yet, this strategy wasn't without controversy. Many traditionalists in Musashi's time considered such tactics dishonorable. To them, battle was supposed to be pure, sword against sword, skill against skill. But Musashi understood a darker truth. Purity doesn't win wars, strategy does. And he was willing to bear criticism if it meant surviving and triumphing. In his eyes, honor meant nothing if you were dead. The irony is that while others judged him for breaking convention, Musashi was decades, even centuries, ahead of his time. Modern psychology would later confirm much of what he practiced intuitively: the devastating effect of stress, the power of framing situations, the ability of calmness to disarm aggression. Musashi didn't have the vocabulary of modern science, but he lived the reality. He was, in many ways, the first true psychologist of combat, and perhaps that's why his no-sword strategy remains so unsettling. It forces us to question what real strength is. Is it the ability to swing a blade with deadly accuracy? Or is it the ability to manipulate the entire battle before the first strike? Musashi would argue that true mastery is invisible. It's not the clash of swords but the silence before them, the moment when one man's will has already bent to another's. That was Musashi's genius. He taught the world that sometimes the greatest victories are won without fighting at all. And as his legend grew, so did his willingness to push boundaries even further. Not just mastering one sword, but daring to wield two, rewriting the very rules of combat itself. Reinventing combat two-sword style.
If Musashi's no-sword strategy proved that the mind was deadlier than steel, his next innovation proved something even more radical, that tradition itself was just another weapon to be broken. In a time when every school of swordsmanship clung to rigid techniques and sacred rituals, Musashi shattered convention by daring to wield two swords at once. This approach became known as Naiten-ichi-ryu, or the school of the strategy of two heavens as one. It wasn't simply about carrying an extra blade for show, it was about redefining what combat could be. For centuries, samurai trained almost exclusively with the katana, the long sword, treating it as the noble extension of the warrior's soul. The shorter blade, the wakizashi, was seen as a backup weapon, or one reserved for close quarters. Rarely did anyone think to use them together, but Musashi, never content to follow the beaten path, saw opportunity where others saw limitation. With two swords, he rewrote the rhythm of combat. One blade could parry while the other struck, turning defense into offense with seamless fluidity. Where his opponents expected a single line of attack, Musashi offered two, overwhelming them with unpredictability. Imagine facing an enemy who doesn't just block your strike, but punishes you for it in the same heartbeat. That was the terror of Musashi's duel style, a dance of steel that few could follow, let alone survive. But the brilliance of Naiten-ichi-ryu wasn't just in mechanics. It was in psychology. The sight of a man wielding two blades instantly unsettled opponents. It broke their expectations before the fight even began. Samurai were conditioned to face the long sword alone. To suddenly confront two flashing weapons was to realize, in an instant, that their training had left them unprepared. Fear crept in. Doubt followed, and Musashi exploited both. Critics at the time called his method dishonorable, even reckless. Tradition dictated that one sword was enough, that honor came from mastering a single path. But Musashi was not chasing honor, he was chasing advantage. He understood that clinging to convention was just another form of weakness. To him, the battlefield rewarded only what worked, not what was pure. If breaking the rules secured victory, then the rules deserved to be broken. This mindset, to innovate when others imitate, is what kept Musashi ahead. He didn't worship tradition, he dissected it. He took what was useful, discarded what wasn't, and built something entirely new. And this wasn't limited to combat. It reflected his entire philosophy of life. To Musashi, survival required adaptability, and adaptability required courage. The courage to defy norms, to risk criticism, and to embrace change long before others saw its value. Think about how radical this was in his time. Feudal Japan was a culture steeped in hierarchy, ritual, and conformity. To reject that system was to risk not just ridicule, but alienation from the very society that defined you. And yet Musashi thrived because of it. His two-sword style wasn't just a technique, it was a declaration: I will not be bound by the past. Modern parallels are everywhere. The innovators who change industries, the athletes who reinvent the game, the leaders who disrupt entire systems, they all carry Musashi's spirit. They don't win by following the rules, they win by rewriting them. Where others fear breaking from tradition, they see opportunity. Where others cling to what has always been, they ask what could be. Musashi embodied this mindset centuries before the word innovation became fashionable. And his dual sword method wasn't simply about efficiency, it was about forcing evolution. He taught that the path to mastery isn't paved with imitation but with reinvention. To cling to one style, one strategy, or one way of thinking is to invite stagnation, but to embrace versatility is to remain untouchable. What's striking is that Musashi didn't limit this philosophy to his own victories. In his writings, he urged others to experiment, to adapt, to constantly test themselves against new challenges. He believed that the true enemy wasn't another swordsman, it was rigidity, the inability to change. The man who refuses to adapt is already defeated, even if he doesn't realize it yet. And that is the true genius of Netten Ichiro. It wasn't about holding two swords, it was about holding two possibilities, two perspectives, two ways of thinking in one moment. It was about refusing to be predictable, about remaining fluid in a world that demanded conformity. His two-sword style was less about combat than it was about mindset. The mindset of staying several steps ahead, always reinventing, always refusing to be cornered. But Musashi's obsession with adaptability didn't end with technique. He carried it into every part of his life. He studied painting, calligraphy, sculpture, and philosophy, absorbing lessons from each discipline and folding them back into his strategy. Every opponent, every failure, every pursuit outside the battlefield became material for reinvention. His life itself became proof of his creed: evolve or perish. And yet, for all his reinventions, Musashi never lost sight of one truth: the world would always change faster than anyone could anticipate. To survive meant not just adapting to shifts, but anticipating them, flowing with them, bending without breaking. In other words, to master combat was to master change itself. This philosophy would carry him beyond the battlefield and into the deeper wisdom of his later years. Because while the two-sword style shocked his enemies and cemented his legend, Musashi knew there was an even greater challenge ahead: mastering not just the weapons in his hands, but the ever-changing currents of life itself.
Adaptability and change. If there was one lesson Musashi returned to again and again, it was this: adaptability is survival. The battlefield, like life itself, is never static. Conditions change, opponents surprise you, and circumstances shift when you least expect them. To cling to one rigid strategy was, in Musashi's mind, a form of suicide. The only path to victory and to life was to flow, to adjust, and to remain fluid in every encounter. From the beginning of his career, Musashi's adaptability set him apart. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not lock himself into a single style, nor did he blindly worship the traditions of a particular school. Instead, he treated every duel as a classroom. Each opponent became a teacher, each encounter a lesson. If he noticed a flaw in his technique, he corrected it immediately. If he observed a strength in an adversary's style, he absorbed it, tested it, and refined it into his own approach. In this way, Musashi became a living amalgamation of countless strategies, never predictable, never stagnant. This philosophy aligned perfectly with his elemental teachings in the Book of Five Rings, particularly the principle of water. Water has no fixed shape. It takes the form of whatever contains it, whether that's a cup, a riverbed, or the hollow of a rock. Yet in its fluidity lies its strength. Over time, water carves through mountains, reshapes valleys, and outlasts stone. Musashi saw himself in this image. He didn't resist the forces around him. He adapted to them, flowing through obstacles until they broke under his persistence. His adaptability wasn't just about techniques of combat. It extended to mindset. In a culture where honor codes often demanded rigidity, where warriors would rather die than change their approach, Musashi stood as an outlier. He understood that survival required more than pride. It required humility. The humility to admit when something wasn't working. The humility to learn from enemies. The humility to start over if necessary. To Musashi, there was no shame in adapting. The only shame was in refusing to grow. This adaptability is what allowed him to stay undefeated across 60 duels. Each adversary came with different weapons, different styles, and different strategies. But Musashi never faced them with the same plan twice. He shifted his tactics like a shadow, keeping opponents guessing, turning their expectations into traps. And because of this, no one could ever prepare for him fully. By the time his enemies realized what was happening, it was too late. The brilliance of this mindset is how universally it applies. Musashi's philosophy of adaptability is not confined to ancient battlefields. In truth, it mirrors the struggles we face in our own time. Think of businesses that collapsed because they refused to change with technology. Think of relationships that fell apart because people clung stubbornly to old patterns. Think of individuals who burned out because they tried to solve new problems with outdated solutions. These are all failures of rigidity, the exact mistakes Musashi warned against centuries ago. By contrast, the most successful individuals today embody Musashi's water-like approach. Entrepreneurs pivot their companies when markets shift. Athletes reinvent their training when injuries force new realities. Artists abandon old techniques in pursuit of fresher expressions. Politicians, negotiators, even ordinary people facing personal struggles, all thrive when they adapt. Whether they know it or not, they are living Musashi's lesson: the future belongs to the flexible, and yet, adaptability is not easy. It demands letting go of certainty, stepping into discomfort, and risking failure in order to evolve. Musashi embraced this with ferocity. He didn't just tolerate change, he sought it out. After duels, he would analyze what worked and what failed. After observing rival schools, he would dissect their movements and philosophies, not to mimic them, but to learn what could make him stronger. He treated change as fuel, feeding his growth instead of resisting it. But his obsession with adaptability also carried a deeper philosophical dimension. Musashi believed that to resist change was to resist life itself. Everything from the turning of the seasons to the rise and fall of empires was in constant motion. To pretend otherwise was delusion. The wise strategist, he argued, must accept impermanence and use it, rather than be crushed by it. It is no coincidence that some of Musashi's greatest victories came not from raw strength, but from his ability to surprise, to appear where he was least expected, to strike in ways no one anticipated. He thrived on unpredictability because he knew life itself was unpredictable, and in this he offered not just a martial strategy, but a universal truth. You cannot control the chaos of the world, but you can control how you respond to it. Musashi's adaptability is perhaps his most timeless teaching, because it is as relevant in the 21st century as it was in the 17th. The weapons may have changed, but the battlefield remains the same. Whether it's navigating business rivalries, personal challenges, or global crises, those who flow like water endure. Those who remain rigid, no matter how strong, eventually break. And yet, Musashi's adaptability was only one side of his wisdom. As he grew older, he distilled his philosophy even further, leaving behind not just techniques or metaphors, but a set of guiding principles designed to outlast him. It was his final gift to the world, and it came not in the form of a blade, but in the form of words. 21 precepts etched into history as his ultimate legacy. The Dokkōdō 21 Precepts. As Musashi approached the twilight of his life, his victories behind him, and his body, worn by decades of conflict, he turned inward. The man who had cut down 60 opponents in battle, who had redefined swordsmanship and strategy, realized that his greatest legacy wouldn't be the duels he fought or the schools he founded. It would be the philosophy he left behind, the distilled essence of a lifetime, spent mastering both combat and existence. That philosophy took form in a document known as the Dokkōdō, or the Way of Walking Alone. Unlike the Book of Five Rings, which focused on strategy and combat. The Dokkōdō was deeply personal, written just days before his death, in 1645. It outlined 21 precepts, short, sharp statements that cut straight to the heart of how one should live. There were no flowery words, no lengthy explanations, just stark truths, forged in the crucible of a life spent facing death. It was Musashi's final lesson, not for warriors alone, but for anyone who sought clarity in a chaotic world. The precepts themselves reveal the mind of a man who had stripped life down to its essentials. He warned against attachment, against indulgence, against dependence on comfort or material wealth. One precept declares, "Do not pursue pleasure for its own sake." Another commands, "Do not fear death." Still another advises, "Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need." These weren't abstract philosophies, they were survival strategies, tested on battlefields where hesitation or desire could mean death. But beyond the battlefield, the Dokkōdō reads like a manual for mental freedom. Musashi had seen how men enslaved themselves, not by swords, but by greed, pride, fear, and obsession. He believed that true strength required liberation from these chains, to be attached to possessions, to obsess over recognition, to cling to fleeting pleasures. All of these, to Musashi, were forms of weakness. They made you predictable, fragile, and easy to control. A man who desires nothing cannot be manipulated, and a man who fears nothing cannot be conquered. One of the most striking precepts is, "Do not regret what you have done." In a life marked by violence, this could sound cold, but Musashi's meaning was deeper. Regret, he believed, was wasted energy. To dwell on the past was to blind yourself to the present. You cannot adapt, you cannot move forward, if you are shackled to what cannot be changed. Instead, you must learn, adjust, and keep walking. This was not a call to cruelty, but a call to clarity, a refusal to let yesterday dictate tomorrow. Another profound statement reads, "In all things have no preferences." At first, this seems impossible. How can a human being live without preferences? But Musashi's point was not to eliminate individuality. It was to remain adaptable. Preferences can calcify into weakness. To insist that life conform to your tastes is to guarantee disappointment. By training yourself to accept whatever comes, you gain a kind of invincibility. You flow like water, just as he described in the Book of Five Rings. What makes the Dokkōdō so powerful is its brutal simplicity. Unlike long philosophical texts, it offers no comforting explanations, no hand-holding. It is a series of blades, each one slicing away illusion and self-deception. And yet, beneath the austerity, it contains a strange compassion. Musashi was not telling others to live a joyless life. He was telling them to free themselves from fear, from longing, from the traps that make men suffer needlessly. He was offering a roadmap to inner strength, one that demanded sacrifice but promised liberation. Centuries later, these 21 precepts still resonate. Modern readers find in them a cure for distractions and anxieties that dominate our world. In an age of endless consumerism, Musashi's command to do not collect weapons or practice with weapons beyond what is useful feels like a rebuke to hoarding and status chasing. In a culture obsessed with likes, followers, and recognition, his words, "Do not seek to possess either goods or fiefs for your old age," cut through the noise, reminding us that validation is a trap. And in a time when fear of death drives entire industries, his cold clarity, "Do not fear death," challenges us to live more fully by accepting mortality. The Dokkōdō is Musashi's final duel, but the opponent is not another warrior. It is the human ego. Every line is a strike against vanity, greed, or fear. Every precept is a reminder that victory in life is not about defeating others, but about mastering yourself. It is no coincidence that Musashi titled it, "The Way of Walking Alone." By the end of his life, he had realized that the greatest battles are fought within, and that true mastery requires solitude, not the isolation of loneliness, but the independence of spirit that allows a man to stand unshaken, whether surrounded by allies or left entirely to himself. To read the Dokkōdō is to step into the mind of a man who stripped life to its essence. It is uncomfortable, it is uncompromising, but it is also liberating. It is Musashi's final gift, a path not just for warriors, but for anyone seeking clarity in a world drowning in noise. And yet, even with these profound precepts, Musashi's story was not free of criticism. His unorthodox methods and ruthless mindset unsettled many in his own time, and still do today. Which raises a deeper question: was Musashi a genius ahead of his age, or a brutal opportunist who bent honor to his own will? The critiques and the legacy. No legend, no matter how great, escapes criticism. For every admirer who saw Musashi as the pinnacle of strategy and wisdom, there were detractors who branded him dishonorable, unorthodox, even dangerous. And in many ways, these criticisms reveal just as much about Musashi's genius as his victories do. Because when you break rules as ruthlessly as he did, you will always leave controversy in your wake. One of the most common charges leveled against Musashi was that his methods lacked honor. In feudal Japan, the samurai code placed enormous weight on ritual, etiquette, and fairness in combat. Battles were often formal affairs, with strict rules governing conduct. But Musashi rarely played by those rules. He showed up late to duels. He fought dirty, exploiting not just an opponent's body, but their mind. He once killed a famous warrior, Sasaki Kojiro, using a wooden sword he carved from an oar, striking him down in a duel that some considered trickery rather than valor. To the purists of his time, these tactics looked less like strategy and more like deceit. Yet here lies the paradox. The very qualities that made him controversial also made him unstoppable. Musashi understood that the battlefield was not a stage for ritual, but a struggle for survival. Honor meant nothing if it left you dead. He once wrote that you can win with a long weapon, and you can win with a short weapon. In short, it is the spirit of winning that matters. To him, victory was the only law that counted. His critics saw arrogance. His followers saw clarity. Others argued that his teachings, particularly in the Book of Five Rings and the Dokkōdō, were too rigid or archaic to apply in modern life. After all, how could the musings of a 17th-century swordsman hold meaning in a digital age of algorithms, markets, and politics? But this criticism often collapses under closer inspection, because at their core, Musashi's lessons were never about the sword. They were about perception, timing, adaptability, and mental clarity, concepts that remain timeless. The weapons have changed, but the battlefield of human conflict has not. There were also personal criticisms. Some contemporaries described Musashi as aloof, solitary, even cruel. He often rejected traditional attachments, refusing wealth, refusing family ties, refusing comfort. To some, this seemed less like wisdom and more like coldness. But Musashi would argue that such detachment was necessary. To remain free, a man must avoid chains, and attachments are chains disguised as comforts. Whether one sees this as enlightenment or as self-imposed exile depends on perspective, and perhaps that is the essence of Musashi's legacy. He was not meant to be liked. He was meant to be remembered. His life forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we truly value. Do we prefer honor over survival, tradition over innovation, comfort over freedom? Musashi's existence challenges us to face those trade-offs honestly, even when the answers are unsettling. Despite criticism, Musashi's legend endured, and not quietly. Centuries after his death, his writings continue to be studied not just by martial artists, but by generals, business leaders, athletes, and philosophers. His Book of Five Rings is assigned reading in military academies. His Dokkōdō is quoted in self-help books. His life story has been retold in countless films, novels, and even manga, each trying to capture the elusive spirit of the man who who seemed to live 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Why does his influence endure? Because Musashi's core lesson cuts across time. The world is chaos, and only those who adapt, who strategize, who think deeper than others, will endure. His story is a reminder that unpredictability is not an obstacle. It is the natural state of life, and within that chaos lies opportunity for those who know how to seize it. Today, his name is invoked far beyond the battlefield. In boardrooms, leaders quote his insights on timing. In sports, athletes channel his focus on rhythm and adaptability. In the arts, creators resonate with his belief that mastery requires both discipline and freedom. Even in personal struggles, relationships, identity, the pursuit of meaning, Musashi's words echo, flow like water, act with clarity, abandon fear. Yet Musashi's legacy also carries a darker undertone. To follow his path requires sacrifice, detachment, solitude, and sometimes ruthlessness. His way is not for everyone, but perhaps that is the point. He didn't write for everyone. He wrote for those willing to confront the chaos of life head-on, without illusions, without excuses. In the end, Musashi's critics and admirers are both right. He was unorthodox. He was ruthless. He was uncompromising. But he was also visionary, adaptable, and profoundly wise. His contradictions are what make him human, and it is in that humanity that his teachings find their power. Centuries may pass, but the lesson remains. The sharpest blade is not the sword in your hand, but the strategy in your mind. Musashi's genius was not in killing opponents, but in revealing that the greatest victories, in battle, in business, in life, are won before the fight even begins. His life was proof that to outsmart the world, you must first outsmart yourself. And so, Musashi's legacy endures, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as something far more compelling. A man who understood the chaos of existence and carved his way through it with strategy, clarity, and relentless adaptability. The world will always change, but Musashi reminds us that if we sharpen our minds as he sharpened his blade, we too can stay 10 steps ahead, no matter how unpredictable the battlefield becomes.